Hey, good morning, everybody. Just a reminder again, in the back of the program, starting on page 73, there are surveys to fill out for the speakers. If you can fill those out, take them just outside the store and put them in a basket. So that will help improve the program later on, and you'll also be you'll also get into the drawing for the Kindle Fires. But now we have Mike Laverick. The guy has been traveling all night. He got here in about 2 this morning because of the thunderstorms. He's a blogger, speaker, so give him a little slack if he stumbles like I am. And give him a round of applause, and let's hear what he has to say.
How long have I got?
Yeah, an hour and a half, whatever you need.
Okay. Well, I'd like to begin by just first thanking the team who run the VTUG here for bringing me out. Although the journey was a bit horrendous, I did actually make it in the end, which is the main thing. Nobody wants to travel that distance and then not get to speak. But thank you very much for making me feel so welcome and for handling all the logistics. In case you don't know who I am, the name is Mike Laverick, and I run a blog called RTFM Education, which stands for Read the Fine Manual. Yeah. What I like to say is RTFM stands for Quality, Assurance, but we all know what it actually means. I've been around in the VMware community for about 10 years, really. I started off in 2003 on the forums, put a few guides up on my website, and then within a month, my website got torn down by excessive downloads of all these guides I was producing. So at that stage, I thought I should have been charging $1 a download on these things, and then I would have been as rich as Croesus. And that's led on to me doing books, and one that I did recently was for the VMware Press. It was the first book on the VMware Press. It's called Site Recovery Manager, which is a VMware product, essentially about DR and things like that. And basically the subject of this presentation is a little bit of content from me that I've sort of put together on my own, and then some content that I actually got from VMware last year, the kind of thing that you would normally have to sign an NDA session to see. So it's a little bit of a kind of peek of what the futures might be of the SRM product. So that's the topic. Yeah. I don't see any clocks in the room, so I have no idea what my timing's going to be like. So I'm going to designate this guy at the front here. You've probably got a sheet which says how long I'm supposed to stay on for. And when I get to 10 minutes of running out of time, just go like that at me, and I'll go really quickly and make up the distance. Okay. So DR. Main thing I want to say is I don't represent VMware. I'm independent from VMware, but although I work very closely with the VMware BCDR team, it's me you're getting, not a VMware employee sort of delivering this sort of information. Want to start off with some stats and facts around DR and how bad we are at it, and also talk about some of the options that you have if you don't want to go down the use of VMware's Site Recovery Manager product and what some of the snafus are associated with that. And then the meat and potatoes of the presentation is a quick overview of some of the new functionality in SRM 5, and then towards the back end of the presentation, a quick overview of some of the things that are coming through the pipe kind of this year and a bit of next year as well. So stats and facts. A couple of months ago, I sort of did a Google whack to look for, sort of stats about DR, recoverability of environments. And I was kind of shocked, I guess, at how appalling some of those stats actually were. These numbers come from continuitycentral.com, a US-based website. And I won't read the whole slide out to you because knowing that you're all grown adults, you've been through high school, you know how to read, so the man who reads the PowerPoint to people is, wasting his time. But at a top level, 47% of people's recovery plans are not kept up to date. Why? Well, very often people don't test them frequently enough. Yeah? And between one test, very good. Can I ask, what time do I have to stop? 12, right, okay. I've already used 8 minutes up, how can that be? Yeah. Anyway, yeah, so 47% of people's plans aren't kept up to date. They generally test them once a year or twice a year, and when they do it that frequently, what they find is their environment has changed significantly enough in that 6-month period that the previous recovery plan is of little or diminished use. Yeah. The other thing I want to flag off on this slide is some of the kind of human stuff. 18% communication failures, 17% insufficient training, 14% insufficient documentation. Now, I'm not a believer in the idea that you can go out and buy a product and all your problems will go away. I've got 17 years of being in the IT industry and 17 years of being sold panaceas every single year that will take all your problems away. So where people tend to go wrong with any of these technologies, it isn't the technology. You know, people will focus at the 1% rather than 99% of a product. You know, the 99% goodness, we then focus at the 1% that doesn't fit with our business, while simultaneously ignoring that we normally don't actually implement these products very well. So it matters not a jot whether there's a cross in the box in a particular feature matrix if we don't actually do our job properly. Yeah? So SRM or VMware Site Recovery Manager is not a silver bullet, but then no product ever is. It's us in this room that make these products work, and it's very much dependent on what we do in those environments. Don't expect to go out and just buy something like VMware Site Recovery Manager or Zerto or Virtual Shop and expect wonders to just take place, because it's in the fluffy human stuff where these sorts of things go right and go wrong. So why do people want to virtualize their DR? Back in 2003, was one of the first instructors in Europe who was working as a freelancer. And I remember even all the way back then, we used to talk about one of the benefits of virtualization might be virtual DR. Because in the bad old world of physicalization, that's the word I used to describe the era before we virtualized everything, physicalization. For every business critical server you had in the production environment, you'd need a subsequent physical server in the recovery environment. It's very expensive, yeah? Which may or may not actually take any load or do any usefulness for the business. It's just sat there waiting for a disaster that we hope never ever happens. I often call this a very expensive insurance policy. You know, your home insurance, your car insurance, those premiums you pay every month, they're a waste of money, aren't they? Until you have to claim on them. And DR is a bit like that. DR is a waste of money because it's a bit of a sinkhole in some cases in terms of costs, but where you really feel its value is when you have to claim on it. Yeah? So people are always looking for a way of trying to save money around the world of DR because it can be a bit of an expensive routine. So people saw ways of saving costs, you know. I can have virtual machines in my DR location. What stopped virtual DR becoming a thing that everybody did in the previous decade was the way our industry and the way us as a community attacked virtualization is that we tend to go for the low-hanging fruit, for the easy things that were to virtualize that lacked politics or lacked big resources. And it's a bit difficult to go to management and say we need a plan that takes all our virtual machines and recovers them to a DR location. We need a DR strategy for that old NT4 box that runs a legacy app that nobody ever uses. That's a bit of a tough sell to my management. What I'm kind of hoping and seeing currently is as people move to the 50%, 60% tier 1 and tier 2 applications, businesses start to begin to realize how utterly dependent they are on the virtualization layer, and therefore as a consequence they start asking themselves the question, what if we lost all that virtual infrastructure? We're as dependent on it as we were on our physical infrastructure. So it's a kind of quid pro quo in a way. Because people weren't virtualizing business critical applications, virtual DR was a bit of a tough sell. Now we're in the realm where people are 90%, 100% virtual. I'm hoping that the topic and the concept of virtual DR becomes more significant, more relevant to people. So the challenges, I think, if you're trying to do virtual DR is where you are on that virtualization journey. Oh God, yes, it's that word again. Every time I go and see a presentation, somebody has to mention a journey. But it is a journey of some description, and the more virtual you are, the more interesting this virtual DR will become to you. If you're only at the 5, 10, or 15%, it's not going to be something that is going to be at the top of your list. You're too busy trying to virtualize the rest of that infrastructure and get it into the new environment. So it definitely matters what your ratios are looking like, the densities and the numbers of VMs you've got, and also how critical those applications are to the business. That's when virtual DR starts to become relevant and interesting to people. I'm going to move over here because I feel like I'm standing in one position. The trouble with this mic is that you've got two things in your hand, and I do recognize there's an audience over here. Stop. Thank you for that. Hello. Sometimes people say to me, oh, we don't want SRM. We've got this thing called a stretch cluster. Our applications in Site A are mirrored in Site B, and we don't need you, Mr. SRM man. That's what they sometimes say to me. Now, I don't want to come across as a kind of Mr. Negative about stretch clusters. I love them, but what often my customers don't recognize is the complexities of actually running those stretched environments between two sites, because quite frankly, a lot of those applications that my application owners use, Never Fail, Double Take, Microsoft clustering, were never designed to be stretched like elastic bands from one site to another. When they originally put together, these clustering systems were meant to protect a single service from failing on a single server. So when customers say, oh, what we'll do is take those same technologies and stretch them across two sites, then what they're going to do is rub up against some of the design limitations. There's one word for it, it's called split brain. The assumption is when you have these sorts of stretch clusters is that you have a very reliable network that isn't up and down like a yo-yo, constantly generating false positives and the impression that the site has gone down when actually there's no problem at all. Anybody here doing stretch VMware HA clusters at all? Look at all the hands go up. Yeah. Very difficult to do. It requires quite expensive storage systems that mirror every write that occurs in the DR location to the ones that are generated in production. It's distance limited, yeah, because of the time it takes for a round trip for a write to actually take place, so about 40 to 50 miles. There are a lot of challenges around this. But if you're interested in SRM and introducing it to your business, here's the real challenge. Let's say you're a big company with 3 or 4 different business units, and within each of those business units you've got SQL admins. I guarantee you each one of those business units will have used a different clustering system or availability system. Yeah? What they don't see is in the event of a disaster, I need them and their specialist skills to manage the failover and failback process. But what you'll find is that they only work within their little bubble, and they don't see that as a management issue to myself who manages the virtual infrastructure. It's extremely difficult to have a sensible DR plan wrapped around every different application owner has got their own favorite way of protecting their application. But what you'll really rub up against is their emotional attachment to their particular way of doing things. Yeah? The same emotional attachment that came with, I don't want a virtual machine, I want a physical machine. Look at all the information on the forums that says running SQL inside a virtual machine doesn't work very well. Quid pro quo, ergo, I won't have a virtual machine. It's the same sort of resistance that you will find. One thing I will say though is, at the end of the day, if you're looking for extremely narrow RPOs and RTOs, that service to be up within seconds or even minutes, you're really looking at this kind of technology. VMware Site Recovery Manager is a manual trigger of the failover and failback. It requires C-class executive approval to carry out. It's not an automated process. It's something that we decide that the nature of the disaster is so serious and so bad that we're going to go for the big red button. Yeah? So you may, if you have high requirements for a service to be online within a minute or 2 minutes or less, still need this sort of clustering software. In the future, we'll be able to blend all these things together, but we're not in the future, we're in now, and those things are going to take some time to come down the pipe. So there are some challenges around stretch clusters. I don't think it's a one-all solution. It needs specialist hardware in some cases if you're doing VMware clustering, like EMC's vPlex or NetApp Metro cluster. And you can have all manner of complexities about, do you change the IP address when you fail over? Does it stay the same? How long does it take for a DNS update to ripple through? So people are directed to the right service after the failover has taken place. And our old friend, split brain. The other thing I would say about this is if you're specifically looking at stretch clusters for VMware HA, VMware's high availability, the list of supported vendors is very small. Last year, there was only one vendor, and that was EMC and vPlex. to the degree that some conspiracy theorists thought that was some sort of cozy relationship between EMC and VMware, that somehow it had been cooked up, in a smoky room somewhere over cigars and drinks and things like that. The reality was that VMware made their requirements for supporting clusters with the HA so high such that only a small number of vendors could actually get into the HCL, and it just so happened to be EMC. But that which we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence, as the great man said. But there are other people being added to this list. I believe Left Hand have been added to this list, and NetApp are now on the list, or going to be on the list very soon, for stretch clusters for VMware. This particular slide you might be interested in, it's not mine. It actually came from NetApp. I was doing a briefing with them about 2 years ago where they compared their own stretch clustering, NetApp Metro cluster, to what SRM does. And what I really liked about this slide is that it honestly showed where SRM's strengths and weaknesses were compared to a clustered solution. Now, again, I don't want to read all this out to you because you're all able-bodied people who can read for yourself. But I'll draw your attention to the fact that SRM is tightly integrated with Virtual Center, but most of these stretch clustering systems are not. That you can do non-disrupted testing with SRM, doing DR tests during the day in production hours, but you can't do that with most clustering systems. The way you test most clustering systems is you either do a manual failover through software, or you literally pull the plug to see whether it fails over. Not a very wise thing to do during production hours, just in case it doesn't come out as you hope and expected. So it still means you have to take maintenance windows, or even do that thing where you do your testing out of office hours during the weekend, aligned to a holiday. So if anything goes a little bit pear-shaped, as they say where I come from, then you've still got time to get it up and running before end users come back. Notice how the failover is transparent for a cluster, happens automatically, that's the whole point. But with SRM, it's a manual process that you decide whether you want to engage. Now, one of the most common questions I've been asked as a guy who's an expert in VMware SRM is, can you make SRM automatically fail over virtual machines from site A to site B? How many of you in this room feel a little bit uncomfortable or nervous about such an idea? I'm hoping more hands would go up. I'd be hoping like everybody's hand would go up. So, what logic or intelligence would have to be in place to decide that site A was completely dead, a smoking crater, that the virtual machines would automatically get moved to a DR location without my involvement? Lots of conditions. Yeah? And I tell you, the number of conditions in that statement would be so great that the chance of answer being true is like 1,000,000 to 1 of it ever happening. And you'd probably find yourself having to do it manually anyway, triggering the failover process. Remember, it's a serious decision to say that we've had a loss of a complete site. It really needs somebody with a brain, not a computer, to make that decision, which is a qualitative judgment about, is the nature of our problem that significant that we want to introduce something which in itself has business risk attached to it, and may in fact potentially, if done improperly, actually make the business in a worse state than it started out with. I don't think any if statement or any piece of software can make those sorts of judgments. I guess in the best of all possible worlds, we would blend these solutions together, stretch clusters and Site Recovery Manager, to get the best of all possible worlds. That's a quite expensive solution, and currently in the world of VMware HA and SRM, those two technologies are currently incompatible. Stretch HA assumes you've got one virtual center, one data center, and the ESX hosts live in two different sites, but are in part of the same cluster. SRM assumes you've got two virtual centers with ESX hosts managed separately and independently by two distinct management domains. It's a rock and a hard place. The requirements are totally different. The operative word in all of that, though, was the word currently. So although we have this sort of tension between two different technologies, that is something that you should expect to change in a relatively short period of time. I can't say anything more than that, except if we have a conversation over beers, of course. So anybody wanting to find out more information from me, you just have to get me drunk, and then it all comes out. I'm sorry. Can't help it.
We can do that tonight.
Yeah, you know. So the other thing I get customers saying to me is that we don't need this site recovery manager because we've got these gurus who know their way around PowerShell and Power CLI and all the stuff that SRM does. We've got scripting that does this. Yeah. Out of curiosity, anybody doing scripted homebrew DR at the moment? You know, you replicate your VMs and then you run scripts that recover the VMs. Anybody doing that? No? Okay, fair enough. Well, you know, I could go on and labour the point about how complicated it is, how it's a lot of heavy lifting, and you spend more time trying to engineer a scripted solution than you actually do focusing on, well, did the application or the service come up? You're so focused on, you know, trying to just get the basics working, you don't then have time to really, you know, spend on your recovery plan. But here's the real reason I often say to my customers they should think again about scripted solutions. And it's the last statement at the end. Yeah, which begins, there was this guy called Mike. We really miss Mike. Mike was such a great guy. He wrote all these scripts that do all these magical things within VMware. He was such a guru. Then Mike left. Anyway, you're the new hire. There's this 6,000 line script that Mike wrote which didn't work last night. Can you have a look at it and then fix it by Tuesday of next week? Anybody had that experience? I have, yeah. 9 times out of 10, you look at Mike's scripts and you go, why does that variable get added to itself and then 5 get added as well? Yeah. What was Mike thinking about when he did it? Have you seen that in scripts? Variable plus 5. And you think, well, what does the 5 represent? Some sort of cosmic magic number that makes his script work. If it was 4, it would all fall apart. I mean, I've had that, literally, not with Power CLI, but with VBS scripts in spreadsheets. You know, 50,000 lines or something stupid, doesn't work anymore, can you fix it next week? I'm the contractor, I don't even work here full time, how am I supposed to get to the bottom of why your script doesn't work? Here's the other way that conversation worked out. Mike hasn't left the business, Mike is still there. That's worse. Yeah, because Mike really thinks he's someone special. Goes around the business telling everybody how important he is, yeah, and how the world would collapse and the sky would fall in if it wasn't for good old Mike keeping it all together. You met people like this? I hate those people. Yeah, because when I was like 21, 22, I joined this company and there were guys there who'd been there 10 years longer than me. I was full of beans, willing to learn, but boy did they rub my nose in it every single opportunity, telling me how little I know and how important they were. And I'll tell you what, once you've been through that experience, once Mike eventually does leave and you start looking at what a great guy was, you start looking at the quality of the work, you think, this isn't difficult, this isn't hard. I could have actually made that 6,000 line script be 600 lines. And you start to realize what a, forgive my French, an asshole Mike was. Yeah? So whatever experience you've had, oh, Bob, he was so great and he's left. Oh, everybody cries. Oh, that's Bob. Oh, God, I can't wait to see the back of Bob because we hate him. The business thing becomes entrapped to these scripts. They become beholden to these scripts. Their disaster recovery is dependent on this person. What if Bob or Mike is under a bus at the time of the disaster taking place? Who's going to fix the script then when it's going to recover many virtual machines and without it it's going to take you days to recover? Yeah. So there's a business risk attached to that. SRM, in contrast, is a push-button affair that even the most modest of operator-stroke admin could probably drive if they needed to. Yeah. I'm not saying it's, you know, you big button and everything is wonderful and rosy in the garden, yeah, because that's easy to say, but it doesn't actually pan out that way. But at least the heavy lifting is taken out of the process and you can focus on the one or two that didn't recover in the way that you expected. And you know what? That's probably down to the application inside the virtual machine and it had nothing to do with the VM itself, yeah. So the other thing I would say at the very top is a lot of customers think, oh, we'll buy SRM and then we don't have to do any scripting. Think again. There are call-outs in the SRM product that allow you to do any type of scripting you like. VBS, yeah, PowerShell, anything you like, even DOS batch files if you so, if that floats your boat. And I've got examples in my book where when I recover the VMs in the DR location, I actually degrade the amount of memory and CPU they're assigned, because I'm assuming in this particular scenario that the amount of resources in the DR location is less than in the production environment. So that, it doesn't take scripting away, but what it does is liberate you to focus on the scripts that really matter. Like say you're recovering a Microsoft cluster, primary and secondary, and you want to bring both nodes up in the DR location. We all know that one of those nodes must come up first, and it's identity, primary and secondary, sorted out first before you start bringing any other nodes up. Otherwise, you could end up in a worse state than you began with. And that's the kind of scripting you should really be focusing on, not presenting storage and renaming stores and registering VMs and making sure that they're out on the right port groups, in the right resource pool, in the right folders, in the right clusters, that they get powered on in the right order, yada, yada, yada. That's what SRM should take over. So I realized that for a while I've been talking about this thing called SRM, but I didn't really give it a formal introduction. I just kind of assumed that you would know what Site Recovery Manager was, which was perhaps a little bit silly, but there we are. Basically, SRM is VMware's DR automation tool. It has this thing called protection groups where you can protect individual VMs. It's compatible with the vast majority of array-based replication. And in last year's release, the version 5 release, VMware introduced vSphere replication, which allows you to replicate a per virtual machine basis a VM from any type of storage to any other type of storage across the network. At the moment, we've still got the word Site Recovery Manager inside the name, but a lot of us think that really that name is not a good name. Maybe what it should be called is Site Manager, SM. Or even Site Availability Manager might be a better name. And that's because I've got a significant number of customers who actually use SRM, not because they've had a disaster, but as part of a data center move, and they're wanting to move their VMs from one site to another. That's a legitimate guerrilla, inverted commas, use of SRM, but I think that's also a kind of indication of the kind of direction that VMware wants to go with this particular product. They want to take it out of a relatively narrow remit of DR and spread its wings to include other aspects of keeping a virtual machine available regardless of where it lives. In case you don't know, there's two kind of deployments for SRM. Your kind of classical on the left, production location, it's referred to as the protected site in SRM, and then a dedicated recovery location, often referred to as the recovery site. The diagram on the left also supports a bidirectional configuration where Site A replicates to Site B and Site B replicates to Site A. So if you've got two offices that are near each other, New York and New Jersey, for example, you could do replication between each other. And that is a very common configuration because it means you've got an active kind of DR and you're sweating the assets, there's that catchphrase, of both resources at both sites, rather than having a dedicated location where the kit sort of sits idle, doing nothing apart from dev work potentially, waiting for disaster to actually strike. And then over on the right-hand side, we've got what's called the shared site model. A little bit of warning, when you say the word shared site, make sure your false teeth are in place and that you haven't had too much to drink. Because you could find yourself saying something entirely different. I'll say no more. Shared site. It's kind of squarely pitched at the kind of provider space. So I, as a big service provider, Terremark, Savis, yada yada, could offer to you as customers resources in my data center, and you could recover your VMs to my location if you wanted to. It's also entirely viable that a large corporate with large data center hubs around the US could then offer DR as a service to different business units or different regional offices. So it's not a service provider only model. You could be the service provider to other parts of the business if you wanted to see it that way. This is quite high level kind of stuff. And the next couple of slides, I just want to sort of flag up some of the major improvements that have happened in SRM since version 5. This is not a sales pitch because I'm not a salesperson, but what I'll also try and do at the same time is flag up some of the what the salesperson doesn't tell you. Yeah. So scalability, SRM has increased its scale, but not by much. We can now have more protection groups. These are groups that contain data stores, which in turn contain VMs which you protect. Yeah? So they've increased the number of those, and they've increased the number of concurrent recovery plans that you can run to a maximum of 30. Sadly though, the number of VMs you can protect is still at 1,000. Now, for a lot of people in this room, 1,000 VMs might be a horrifying number of VMs that you would never actually have. And then for another section of this audience, you might just go, yeah, we've got 4,000 of them. So in a single site. So depending on your scalability, whether you're rubbing up against these numbers very much matters on your size of business. But I think it's something as we get into the world of cloud is going to have to go up. Because cloud generally means big, not small. Yep. There's a new feature in SRM5 called planned failover. It's kind of been there always in the product because there is an element of disaster that can take place where it isn't catastrophic. In fact, the disaster might not have even happened yet. So, as an example of that, you could have some sort of major power infrastructure change taking place in the next 3 months. Because of environmental restrictions, you're not allowed to have a diesel generator and produce your own power and all that kind of stuff. And therefore, as a precaution, you decide to move your VMs from one site to another, just in case. Yeah? Another example, maybe the building that's opposite you is to be demolished, and they've worked out the best way of doing that is to blow it up. And of course, the demolition team has reassured you that the building will fall away from yours, not at you. But maybe the business decides, that's a risk that we don't want to really contemplate. Let's proactively move the VMs to another location, and therefore, if our demolition team gets it wrong, we won't be watching a building sort of coming at us, thinking, "Oh dear, what do I do now?" Run away very quickly. Yeah. So there's there's catastrophic disaster, and then there's other types. Here in the US, obviously you have extreme weather conditions and things like it, which we don't have in the UK. Well, we have extreme weather. It's just called rain all the time. That's where our summer has gone this year. Just rain every day. Anyway, I won't worry you about my weather, but you know what I'm getting at. Hurricane Alley, all that kind of thing. You can often get notification some hours or whatever before landfall actually takes place, which means you can do something about it. Yeah? There are obviously other disasters of which there are no notifications, yeah? So we have to deal with both. But this planned migration, it's kind of always been there, but what's new is that they actually do a little bit of work in terms of syncing. Yeah? What they'll do is a forced sync of the VMs that you're migrating to the new location down to the array to make sure that even if you're only replicating once an hour, you get what happened in the last 15 minutes. They then shut down those VMs in a graceful manner. Yeah, think of a ballerina on stage, not me, by the way. Gracefully, which obviously flushes the contents of their disk and memory cache to disk. And then they do a second sync to grab those. And then the recovery begins in the DR location, thus guaranteeing that you get every last bit of data, regardless of the fact that your replication may not be every nanosecond in terms of frequency. Too many animated slides in these decks, I think. This is what a planned migration might look at. Apologies for the people at the back that you can't really see this. There's a little radio button that says planned migration and another radio button that says disaster recovery. Yeah? Incidentally, if you do have a disaster, the little radio button that says planned migration is dimmed. Yeah? Because you hope that's obvious. You can't do your planned migration if you've got a large crater with nothing in it. Yeah? It's funny, isn't it, in the world of VMware and virtualization, how quickly urban myths can take hold. I mean, you all laughed because you knew that was a ridiculous thing to say, but I've had customers say to me that their DR plan is, if disaster strikes, they're going to use vMotion to move their VMs from one location to another. Okay? Now, I know what the hardware restrictions are and limitations are, gigabits, point-to-point, shared storage, shared networking, yeah. But usually I just say, can I ask you know, your DR location, how far away is it from the actual, you know, production site? And I kid you not, one of my customers said, about 30 meters. I was like, okay. Forget about the whole vMotion that you need 2 functioning ESX servers to actually do a vMotion. And if you take an immovable object and drive an unstoppable force at it, there won't be anything to vMotion. The fact that they think a DR location is 30 foot away is their real problem. They need to start again from scratch. But you'd be surprised how often people will talk that way. I think, in fairness, sometimes newbie employees, salespeople at VMware have just gone, yeah, vMotion, you can do that in the event of a disaster anyway. And somebody's just taken that as gospel when it's technically not true at all. Yeah. So I think there's another little bit of a hint there as well, the use of the word migration. Now, when we use the word migration in the world of VMware, we're often referring to vMotion, live migration, or a cold migration, or even a storage vMotion is a migration of types, because although the VM stays on the same ESX host, what we're doing is moving the files from one data store to another. It's a migration of a type. I think VMware is giving you a little bit of a hint there, aren't they? Yeah. What if a customer did have vMotion from one site to another, and they can see the disaster's coming, and they want to utilize that and test that before the disaster actually happens? Wouldn't it be interesting if SRM had some sort of enlightenments to that configuration, such that you could do tests of those vMotions well in advance of the disaster actually taking place, and could work out how long it would take to move 100 VMs from one site to another, based on variabilities of latencies, retransmits and drop packets. It's not an easy thing to calculate without testing, is it? So that's a direction I think VMware do want to take with this particular technology. For those customers who have got stretch clusters, who want SRM as well, who want the option to move VMs live from one site to another in the event of a disaster, if they can get there quick enough, they would do that. But if not, their plan B is to use SRM's plans, which are not dependent on those sorts of things being available. Yeah. So the other big feature that's been introduced in SRM version 5 is automated failback. Okay, now I think whenever a software vendor says we've automated this particular process, we should always go, okay, vendor, how much have you automated? Yeah. The backstory to this is when SRM 1 and SRM 4 came out, a lot of customers would say to me, where's the failback button, Mike? Where's the button that takes my VMs from the DR location back to the production site? And I said, well, it doesn't exist as a button, but there's basically a sequences of steps, quite a lot of them, by the way, that allows you to invert the replication and send the VMs back to the production site. But it's a lot of steps, and the changes you make are actually quite destructive. You end up clearing out your old config, putting in a new config to get the VMs back to the new location. And once that's been successful, you have to strip out that config to put your original DR plan back in place. It's a destructive process. What automated failback does is take away all those steps. Probably an easy way of explaining how easy it is compared to the old way is in my first books on SRM 1 and SRM 4, the failback chapter ran to about 60 pages in length. I must admit, I do use quite a lot of screen grabs, so it wasn't 60 pages of raw text. There was pictures in there as well. Woo, what a concept. Now, the new book I've written, that's only 25 pages in length now, yeah? Because it's such a simpler process in comparison. I do hope VMware doesn't carry on doing this, because if they carry on making the products easier and simpler to use, they'll eventually do Mr. Mike Laverick out of his living. There'll be no books and no need for me to stand up and explain it to people. So it needs to be complicated enough that not any old monkey could do it, but it needs to be easier so I can focus on stuff that really counts. So needs to be a bit of complexity. Otherwise, how do I justify my existence on the planet? Great difficulty, probably. But what I would say about this automated failback is failback and taking your VMs back to the production location is a very complicated process. In fact, it's probably more complicated than the disaster. Because let's face it, if disaster strikes and you've got SRM, you don't really need to call Ghostbusters to work out what the next steps would be. Yeah, if you've lost everything, you're going to engage your investment in SRM. But there's a significant risk in the failback process, because the failback process isn't being forced upon you. It's the business deciding that, yes, collectively, we're ready to move back to where we were before. Is that your call? Is that your judgment? If it isn't successful, who's to blame? Yeah, at least with a disaster, if it's an act of God, you can blame it on the weather or whatever. But if a failback process goes wrong and it's a human decision to do that, which then isn't successful, then somebody might say within the senior management, how well was this tested? But here's the real reason that automated failback is only one tiny part of the story. Yeah? When I hit the failback button, what it doesn't do is call my reseller, who then puts on a whole series of pallets replacement hardware, which sends that replacement hardware to a replacement data center, that racks up all that hardware for me, puts ESX on it, configures the networking, puts virtual center on there as well, installs SRM, repairs the site, then engages replication between the two sites, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of human stuff that has to take in place there. It's almost like building a new site if you've had a disaster. Well, it is, because you lost your first site, didn't you? And it's kind of tempered a little bit by the nature of the disaster. I mean, let's say a disaster did strike, but your actual data center is perfectly fine, but for the first 6 months you're facing rolling brownouts and occasional blackouts. Your confidence in that site hasn't got anything to do with its physical integrity, but everything to do with the infrastructure that you get from external providers to that site. Can you see how a button that says fail back is like a tiny part of that process? Yeah? So yeah, great, thanks for reducing the number of steps on your side, but the number of steps on my side remains much the same. Yeah? I mean, here's another example without overbearing the point too much. Let's say you've been in your DR location for 9 months, and in that time you've accrued terabytes worth of changes. Yeah? And because the arrays that were in the production location were lost, you've had to source brand new arrays. Now, do you fancy doing replication of terabytes worth of data through whatever your WAN pipe is? I don't think so. So that means forklifting the arrays to the recovery location, doing a sync that is local, forklifting them to the new location, and then hoping and allowing the normal cycle of replication to accrue such that two sites are in sync ready before you do a failback. Can you see how it's more complicated than a button that says go back? Yeah? So I don't want to oversell what SRM can do. It's actually a two-stage process. A reprotect process inverts the replication, which used to point from site A to site B. It now needs to point in the opposite direction from site B to site A, or from the DR location back to the production site. And then there'd be a wait time as you waited for those sites to become in sync. Yeah? What you would hope is that there was enough bandwidth that whatever your schedule for replication is, it would actually eventually complete that job. I have very rarely, but occasionally seen customers set cycles of replication that are so frequent with the volume of data churn being quite great that the two sites would never ever come in sync with each other. Yeah, because there's simply not enough bandwidth to push the changes within the time frame that they've got. Yeah? So there are complexities to think of that way. Is it distracting when I move from one part of the stage to another? Or is that keeping you awake? Keeping you awake? Okay, fair enough. Some screen grabs, nothing to write home about really. The other big feature I would say is vSphere replication. Now the way this particular thing works is that it sits as a virtual appliance on the ESX hosts, intercepting the changes that take place in the virtual machines and replicating them to another site. The big selling point here is VMware has done for replication what they did for operating systems. They've virtualized it. So it is possible for me to replicate from local storage to local storage at two different sites, from high-end storage from NetApp or EMC or Dell at the production location to cheaper, low-cost tier 3 storage providers at the DR location, that kind of thing. It doesn't care whether it's iSCSI, Fibre Channel or NFS, or local storage, or direct attached storage if you prefer to use that particular phraseology. They're not the only provider in this space. Zerto, who came out of stealth last year, have a virtual appliance that does this sort of replication. And a company based in Europe called Virtual Sharp also has what they sometimes call host-based replication. If you like, this is sort of VMware's attempt at that particular process. So, you know, it should allow for a simpler setup, yeah? I don't need to speak to the storage team and ask them that certain LUNs or volumes should be replicated to another site, yeah? I can do that myself without speaking to the storage people at all, you know. Guess what? I hate those guys too. Joking. There will be some people who are also storage people. I don't want to create any offense. But it means if you are trying to spin up a proof of concept, for example, of SRM quickly without having to bring in other stakeholders, you can do that off your own bat. Bear in mind, though, you will have to speak to the network team because you would be putting bandwidth on the WAN if you were doing it generally across two sites. Most proof of concepts of this product happen within the same rack on the same switch, so they don't touch the wide area network at all, and that removes that as an issue of politics. Yeah. The other big selling point of vSphere replication is it adds a right-click option to the virtual machine, which allows you to replicate just that VM and nothing more. One of the downsides of Site Recovery Manager when it's array-based replication is what if you've got a whole bunch of LUNs and there's 20 VMs on a particular LUN, of which only 12 need protection and the other 8 don't need protection at all. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to replicate them anyway and waste bandwidth? Are you going to do a bit of storage vMotion to kind of tidy up the way the LUNs work to make sure the only VMs that reside on that volume or LUN that you're replicating are the ones you want to protect? Sounds like a casual thing, storage vMotion, but what if those VMs are large ones in the terabyte kind of range? How long is that going to take? What sort of maintenance window might you want to take? Yeah. Of course, in this room, you're all intelligent, experienced people. You know, you've got your LUNs all arranged in a nice, tidy way, haven't you? Because nobody in here would just create a new VM and then sort by which volume had the most free space and just put it on that one, would they? That's what the idiots do, isn't it? Yeah, so, you know, and what about the complexity of VMs with multiple virtual disks which get put on different RAID levels for different performance reasons, different number of spindles and so on. Yeah, so the placement of the VM, even if you have got storage profiles from VMware and vSphere 5 and data store clusters, is something that people have to mentally engage with, and sadly some of our virtual machine creators don't really think of it that particular way. This might be a route out of that particular problem because you only replicate the VMs you want to protect, not things you don't want to protect. This is a quick look at the architecture. The things that are in blue are the things that are new. The rest has kind of always been there since Site Recovery Manager 1. So over on the left-hand side, we have the VRMS, which is a management server, has a database backend, and it basically keeps a record of your configuration. It's coupled to a VRMS at the recovery site. So if the protected site blows up, you've still got your configuration in the DR location. And there is a VRA, an agent that sits inside ESX5, which is looking for those changes in the virtual disk and then shipping them over to a dedicated appliance, the VRS, vSphere Replication Server, which then pushes that to wherever you said you wanted the destination to actually be. This particular slide just shows the bare minimum to get the actual product up and running. In fairness, when I've seen this in production, there's nearly always a VRS at the protected site as well, to allow VMs to be protected from one location to another, or for a failback process to take place as well. This is what it looks like when you've got the plugin enabled. That's exciting, isn't it? And you get a little dialog box that sort of drives you through it. You know, how frequent you want the replication to take place. Do you want to use Microsoft Volume Shadow Copy? Where's the source VM? Where do you want to push those to? And do you want to change the disk format when you do that? So maybe the disk is thick at the production location, but to save disk space, you want it to be thin at the destination. Do you want to replicate every VM? This interface also supports what's sometimes referred to as sneakernet, where you download the VMDKs to a removable storage, stick that with a secure courier, yeah, send it to the DR location, copy them up manually, and then it only has to sync the differences rather than the whole virtual disk on the first sync. Yeah. Of course, when you ship that disk from one site to another, you should ensure that your secure courier employs a team of blacked-out motorcycle riders armed with Uzis to, I'm joking, of course, to protect your data. Yeah. And at the end, you get a finish, and it always says success, yeah, at the end of the process. Yeah. Some limitations. Now, I could go on and on about the limitations about SRM, which are listed here, but the big one is the one at the end. All that goodness and loveliness of automated failback doesn't apply to vSphere replication. It only applies to array-based replication from your storage vendor like Dell, EMC, or NetApp. Yeah? So that's a bit of a, oh, all right, okay. No prizes for guessing what might be on the top of VMware's list in terms of future releases of SRM. This great feature of auto failback, which is incompatible with vSphere replication, needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency because it's difficult to sell, inverted commas, one feature when it's invalidated by another feature that the customer might to use. So expect that to change relatively quickly. A couple of other features to flag up. There's now a more sophisticated service dependency ordering. So you've always had the ability to bring up VMs in the right order, but this allows you to go into even more detail on the properties of the VM. You're allowed to touch it and then say these VMs must power on before this virtual machine gets started. The only thing I would say about this is that the UI isn't particularly visual in terms of the relationships. In honesty, though, a lot of customers might not even need this. It depends on the complexity of your application. You know, if it's multiple tiers, the different priority orders that are built into the SRM product might not be enough for you. New method of doing a re-IP. In the bad old days, VMware used to do a re-IP of a Windows VM using sysprep. Who's watched a sysprep recently of a Windows VM? Anybody suffer from Alzheimer's? Insomnia, you know. If you want to go to sleep, watch a sysprep, you know. It's not the fastest engine in the world. But what this particular method does is it plugs into what's called the VIX, into the virtual machine, speaks directly to the agent, and then can actually re-IP. It takes a matter of seconds rather than the very long time it takes to do a sysprep. I feel sorry for the man who put it, yeah, I watch sysprep. I sometimes watch them as well. It's kind of a nostalgia thing for me. Yeah. All right, well, I'm coming towards the end of the presentation. I've got 4 minutes left. And this is the kind of cloudy side of you know, the futures. Now, first thing to say is, I think in this year, you're going to see VMware talk more about some of the integration they're doing with the cloud for a number of reasons. The cloud suite, which was announced last year, of which SRM is a part, a lot of people would say, well, that's kind of a more mission statement about what VMware's intention is, yeah, with the products, as opposed to we're actually delivering a suite of products now. For example, in that suite, there is vCloud Director, and currently there's no integration between SRM and vCloud Director at all. So there's no sweet spot, if you forgive the pun, between those two products. And that's something that VMware wants to address as a matter of urgency. The other thing I would say is the other reason for this, and it's not just marketing, is VMware needs to capture the service provider market pretty quickly, yeah? People like Terramark and others, and get them using and selling SRM as a service quickly before anybody else gets there before them. So in terms of triaging your resources and putting the most important things at the top, cloud enabling DR is higher than perhaps individual features that I personally might actually want in a kind of nuts and bolts radio button kind of way. Of course, no presentation would be complete without a Dilbert. So there's my Dilbert for the New England VMUG. In case you can't read it at the back, the boss is saying, I hired a consultant to help us evolve our products to cloud computing. To which the consultant goes, blah, 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 cloud, blah, 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 cloud, blah, 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 cloud. To which the boss replies, oh, it's as if you're a technologist and a philosopher all in one. And the consultant just goes, blah, 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 platform. I guess what this is a pointer to is you can talk cloud very easily. Yeah, here's how you talk time, cloud. We're going to produce elastic, on-demand enterprise resources that are delivered in a self-service portal using a service catalog. You can just like talk it, you just have to know the words, stick them in at an appropriate point, and there you're a cloud consultant. You don't actually know how it actually works or how you deliver it, as long as you can talk the talk, everybody will think you're some sort of genius. Yeah, so that's what I like about this particular Dilbert, because I'm interested in how it'll actually work, not in the verbal diarrhea that often accompanies cloud. So one thing that VMware wants to do is offer DR to the cloud with VCD, virtual data center level style protections. Yeah? So if I'm in VMware's vCloud Director and I have a disaster, there is nothing that I can touch currently that allows me to log into at a DR location a kind of replica of my vCloud Directory environment and the VMs inside it, and say now do a recovery. You could also argue that there's no backup facility inside that environment either. So how do I back up a VM inside vCloud Directory except by backup agents inside the VM, something we're all trying to get away from. And the other thing that they want to do is allow SRM to sort of reside within a kind of cell of sort of vCloud Director. So, you know, each organizational virtual data center inside vCloud Director would have that sort of enlightenment from Site Recovery Manager. So more cloud enablement in this particular year, I think. Looking out beyond this year, yeah, into the kind of misty future of next year or the year after, because that's how our industry works, a kind of more policy-based approach to protecting VMs. I'm going to do a risky thing here and ask who uses Site Recovery Manager in this room. The reason it's risky is sometimes no one puts their hands up and I feel very lonely. But anybody using SRM? Oh my friends. Well, this is how SRM currently works. Somebody creates a new virtual machine, and you as the SRM administrator, if they stick that on replicated storage, which is covered by a protection group, there's two ifs, you get a little yellow exclamation mark saying, hey, new VM has arrived. Yeah? Now, Mr. Site Recovery Administrator, decide whether it should be protected or not and where it should live within the recovery plan. Yeah? Now, I guess if you're only creating 1 or 2 VMs per week, per month, that's something that's manageable. One of my customers creates at least 50 to 100 VMs every week. So imagine new VMs keep on popping up and the SRM administrator goes, I wish people would stop creating new virtual machines because it's creating too much work for me. I've got 50 new VMs, they're all named differently. I have no idea what service or application they're associated with. I have no idea whether the guy at the other end who created the VM just accidentally put them on the wrong storage because, you know, the one that had the most free space, well, that happened to be the one that was being replicated by SRM and protected by SRM. In fact, it's a DevOps machine that's used by a developer and it shouldn't be there at all. Now, you could argue that you or we, as virtualization administrators, should be funneling our various consumers to touching the right storage and using the right storage before that even happens as a scenario. But I'm sad to say we don't live in the best of all possible worlds. We live in the world that we are in, and that sometimes happens. So what's really required is a policy engine or a process that can take those VMs, put that through some sort of policy or condition statement that says if your VM meets these particular requirements, then it can be protected. Or how about being asked that question when you create a new VM from day one? So as you create a new virtual machine, you are asked, what level of protection do you want with this? Do you just want to have backup level protection once every 24 hours? Yeah? Do you want it to be protected by Site Recovery Manager? Here's your RPOs, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. Yeah? Or would you like it to be part of a stretch cluster which will offer you immediate availability should something go pear-shaped? Can you see a kind of direction there? At the moment, what we have is a whole series of different products that sort of sit independently of each other. vCDR, the VMware's data recovery appliance, Site Recovery Manager, and then a stretch cluster of HA. All these technologies don't sort of sit with each other. So I think VMware will want to try and move and bring them under one house, and at the same time kind of wrap a policy around that, potentially even being decided by the person who creates the virtual machine, rather than it being created and then having to be processed by some sort of condition statement or policy system after it. The other thing I think we'll see further off in the distance is vMotion Anywhere and SRM being able to orchestrate the movement of VMs from one site to another using vMotion. But critically, the more important thing is being able to test it. As opposed to being able to do it, it's actually nice to be able to test it so you know what the outcomes are going to be. And SRM is a natural home for testing the outcome of a particular task. Yep. And the other thing that we'll be seeing in the distance is trying to remove the IP problem, having to re-IP and change IPs. Currently, the only way to avoid a re-IP in most environments is to either have a stretch VLAN, so the two sites are on the same network. Yeah? Try getting that past the network team, it's a bit of an ask. Or a little bit of a workaround, having some sort of NAT-based system at the DR location, so the VMs don't change their IP addresses, but they sit behind a network address translator which does that translation of their IP data for them. I guess another way is, if you feel confident and comfortable, is going into the routing tables and then redirecting packets that should have gone to site A over to site B. I don't know how many people feel comfortable monkeying around with Cisco commands in the middle of a disaster. Some people would say that's not for us, especially if you don't have in-house specialities in that team. In fairness to VMware, they didn't create this IP problem. Yeah? The fact that the IP is associated with a subnet, and that subnet is in a physical location, and we're now moving VMs to a different subnet to another location. They didn't create that. You know, IP predates even the founding of the company. But I think they want to try and address that, to try and make the virtual machine workload, you know, whatever it is, virtual desktop, server, appliance, be much more portable than it currently is. Okay, I'm actually over my time, I think. It's just after 12. It's 4 minutes past 12. Is it lunch next? Yes. Am I keeping you from your food? Yeah. Well, anyway, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me. I think what I'll do is take questions directly if anybody wants to chat to me. One final thing I would say is, key takeaways: don't see Site Recovery Manager as being a silver bullet. It's another weapon in your armory. Yeah. It's you behind the products and the services and your intelligence behind the applications that you recover, which will dictate the outcome of the recovery itself. Although I have focused on individual features, I want to pull back and remind you that if this software is not used and implemented in the right way, you'll get just as bad outcome than if you had Mike writing the scripts. Thank you very much for your time.